called Nacional Records. So I was working with bands like Montreal, Bombasterio. And it's a long, winding story of how I got to now do work around alternative economics and building the movement for cooperative economics and the cooperative economy. So I went from working on a label to then working as a tour manager to realizing I didn't want to be a tour manager to working as a publicist because that's how I could make money as a freelancer. And all along the way I was working with artists of color in the US who are kids of immigrants or from the global south or Africa. And really kind of, I would say renegade publicist of trying to get these stories into the mainstream press. And would have success at getting some of these narratives in the mainstream press. But was starting to realize that the artists would get signed to multinational labels, and then we're getting screwed. So from there, I went on to work with New York City's Summer Stage, which is the largest free concert series in New York. They do arts and culture in all 5 boroughs. And learned also kind of the fallacies within that system as well. And went on to start a local festival in my hometown of Staten Island called La Isla Bonita Festival, which will, be doing free advertising. So it's kind of not a very compelling story right now. If you want to sit with me one-on-one, I can tell you about it, because it's a long story. But I just learned how extractive and from the inside was in a lot of these like boardrooms with artists and seeing how they were being ripped off and stolen from and exotified and tokenized, especially artists from Africa and Latin America, and have just been on this journey now to how do I understand why this is happening from a systemic point of view. And that has led me to now working at the New Economy Coalition, which is a network in the US of 200 organizations that's working to build the movement for a cooperative economy, democratic economy. And so now I'm at this like interesting intersection of like media organizing, because I did a lot of PR work as a publicist. I worked with a lot of journalists. So that's how Drew and I connected through his work building the movement for media co-ops. I'm at this intersection of artists and artist-owned enterprises because I experienced firsthand how the system was not working for artists. So I'm at that intersection, and then I'm at this intersection of communications for this social movement to build an alternative economy in the US. So now we're partners, and he's an economist, and we're now trying to figure out like how can we bridge these worlds more so that artists are learning more about the movement for alternative economics. The world of cooperative economics can learn that artists are needed, and we're actually going to need to organize artists to get them to build the movement, and just connecting with folks. So that's kind of like a long-winded map of where I've been and why we're here, but that's just my story.
So yeah, thank you. We're both trying to work and expand this intersection between solidarity economy and the arts and culture, right? So Natalia comes out of more of the arts and culture side and found her way to solidarity economy. I come at it from the opposite. I started off, my family is from the Dominican Republic. I grew up in New York. We're both New Yorkers, and was interested in questions of economic development and poverty and all of those. So I worked abroad. I worked in Africa. I worked in Senegal and in Sierra Leone and in Brazil and in several other countries. Came back to the US and actually worked with a group of artists who were a self-described collective of revolutionary artists, right? And they very much believed that you're not going to transform society without artists being heavily involved in its leadership. So I learned a lot from them. And then I'm now a PhD student in economics. So I study economics at the University of Massachusetts, which for those who don't know is one of the very few progressive economics departments. So we do, for example, question things like capitalism, right? Which most economists spend their time celebrating. So, I'm there to sort of try to study the political economy of international finance, which is what most of my research focuses on. But because of our friendship and because of my life experiences, I've also had an interest in the political economy of art. So this is how we both ended up working on, how to expand how to create and expand a new economy for arts and culture, right? So we don't have all the answers. This is a very ambitious title, How We Transform the Music Industry. If we knew how to do it, we would have already done it, right? So we're here to start a conversation. We have some ideas. We know the Canadian context is different. Part of this is just an attempt to organize ourselves, right? To connect to each other, to share experiences and ideas and lessons, and see how we can both, how all of us together can build a better economy for ourselves and for artists. So
if you have questions of anything that we're saying, I think it's a small enough room. Like, please raise your hand if something isn't.
Tout le monde comprend l'anglais. Est-ce qu'il faut traduire? Ça va? Okay. So what we hope you will leave today with, a little less ambitious hopefully, is one, a deeper understanding of the arts and solidarity economy landscape in Montreal and elsewhere, probably more likely the US. Two, I hope we get to form new connections, both, especially with each other, right? So I don't know if everyone in this room knows each other, but everyone here is interested in transforming the music business. So we can start with just the people in this room. And then hopefully some understanding of the different ways art and artists have been financed historically. So from sort of traditional patronage models all the way to a utopian vision of participatory public financing. Should I do this?
Yeah.
So we all know what's wrong with the music business, but it's important. Someone told me recently it's important for the choir to practice, right? Like a lot of times we talk about preaching to the choir, but it's like you want to make sure the choir is in tune and is singing well. So let's preach a little bit to the choir, right? So the first problem, the most fundamental one, is we live in a capitalist society that commodifies music, right? All of you here, I'm sure at some point fell in love with music. You might be in the business of music now, but you probably did not intend to be a business person, right? We all sort of love music because it is an art, it moves us, right? But we live in a capitalist society that takes everything that you want and transforms it into a product to be bought and sold, right? We see this happen with everything, right? Our shelter is turned into real estate investment. Our food is turned into products, to be sold at the cheapest price, regardless of public health. So when it comes to music, many of our problems are, the root of them are the fact that the music is something that is not inherently made to be bought and sold, but we have since turned it into a commodity. We see, for example, in many places, I'm sure it's a topic of discussion here in Montreal, for example, of how musicians are often employed as the first wave of gentrifiers, right? This is, in the US, has become a very hot topic of discussion. Whenever you talk about artists and the economy, people are very worried that if you bring in artists, then we know that, the sort of hipsters and real estate developers are not far behind. One of the things that I really want to highlight, because I'm sure we all know this, but I want to make sure that we talk about why this is and why exactly it's a problem, is once you have a market for music, it's not that everyone who is a seller on that market, everyone who's making music to sell, benefits equally, right? We know that, as far as we can tell, I think about 1% of artists in 2014 earned 77% of music revenue that went to artists, right? So most of the money goes to the record label system. Of the part of the pie that goes to artists, 1% got nearly 4/5 of it, right? So we are in a superstar system where the winner takes all, right? So if you are Beyonce or Jay-Z, then you are a winner, right? You get to become a billionaire from your music and you get to make the music that you want. Most artists, however, are not in that top 1% simply by definition, right? Although I would argue that they're all necessary for that ecosystem to thrive, right? For there to be one Jay-Z or one Beyonce, there's an entire team of other singers and dancers and writers. They didn't come out of anywhere, right? You cannot simply ignore the role that the entire ecosystem of arts and culture plays in creating those one or two superstars, right? And this is sort of a preview of the end. What I would like us to get to is an understanding that music is what economists call a public good. How many people know this term, public good? What's an example of a public good?
Water.
Water is a public good. What else?
Wi-Fi. Electricity, definitely.
Electricity, a little different.
The air, the streets, the way that...
I mean, normally, think about the things that our government, that we expect our government to provide. So stuff like public health, stuff like education. I understand that I come from America where the government does not provide many of these things, but theoretically they should. And why? The argument is, these are all things that have positive spillovers, right? These are all things that other people benefit from, right? So if I am healthy, if I go see a doctor and I pay my doctor's fees, the doctor wins, I win, but all of you also win by having me be a healthy person, right? And if conversely, if I were unhealthy because I couldn't see a doctor and I had some disease that I could communicate, all of you would lose, right? So this transaction between me and my healthcare provider also affects other people, right? And the same thing with education. We all benefit from being in a more educated society. We all lose in being in a less educated society. I would argue that music is the same, right? When you make a great record, yes, you benefit hopefully by selling that record. Whoever buys it is also going to be a happy customer. There are young people or people in other countries who might also benefit from that music, who either cannot afford to pay, or aren't even in the position, like they might simply be elsewhere. So we also have to account for those people. And what happens is the market is never going to do that, right? So, economics 101, textbook economics tells you if you have a public good, the private market will never produce enough of it, and it will never produce it in sufficient quality. And I would argue, and I'm curious if anyone here disagrees, that we have a music economy now that produces not enough music and not of enough good quality because it's provided by the market, right? When it is in essence a public good.
I'm curious for those who make music, what your beef is or what you're experiencing out there. If you have anything to add to like the beef of what's going on.
Any comments? I realize these are bold statements.
Or you can disagree or throw out
I fully agree. I mean, I would disagree with I think there's quality's gone down, but there's a lot of quantity. I don't think the quantity is really necessary. I think the quantity is huge, and there's so much that's of a lower quality, that's so much noise. It's like this big noise going on, and the quality is all buried under it, and it's very hard for it to reach. Whether it's one person or an orchestra of 20 people, that quality is not breaking through the noise. And so to me, it seems like there's this huge mass quantity, and it's much harder now for the quality to even be recognized as such.
I mean, so there's definitely a lot more music, but I think, it all depends on what you think is the right counterfactual, right? So if you imagine a world where everyone who wanted to make music could make it, you would probably have even way more, right? And then if you think about it from a global perspective, again, I used to live in Sierra Leone. It's very, very hard to be a Sierra Leonean artist, right? So, maybe there's too much Canadian music or too much American music, but I'd argue for the world as a whole, there's probably lots of frustrated artists out there who don't have a chance.
I wouldn't argue with that. I think it's more people being creative, and that is a very positive thing. It's just that,
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's a lot more music now. The access and the ability to make music is much simpler now. We have a lot more tools to make even good quality professional music that used to be held by only really big budget record studios that only a select few had access to. But I think the struggle now is we can make all of this music and we can make it to good quality, but now what do we do with it? How do we get it to people in order to survive as functioning in a capitalist system? How do we make that art into something that we can pay our bills with? And that's the struggle that I see happening a lot now.
I feel there's a difference also between the music and the recorded music. The quantity of music and the quantity of recorded music in my mind are two different things. Like music exists out of records, and it's like how to quantify the quantity of music that is not recorded. But I feel like this part is really important
I always wonder when you hear, the Beatles, the biggest selling recording artists, most albums, Beyonce, huge, Michael Jackson, huge. Then I think, at any given moment, at any time of day in the world, somewhere somebody's playing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony hundreds of years later. And so what are we actually talking about here? We're talking about popular music, like modern music?
So I would say we're talking about all of it, because we're about to take a 30,000 foot view of music history starting from like the caveman days. So I feel like part of this is also, and I hope it's not too abstract, is to get us to take a step back and think about what is music? What are we talking about, right? Are we just talking about the stuff that's on the radio? Or are we talking about someone whistling a tune walking down the street, right? And I would argue we're talking more about the second, right? Sort of music writ very, very large. So on that note, music economies historically. So we're about to, again, the point of this is for us to think about how have artists throughout history, I'm talking from like the beginning of us emerging from the primordial like ooze, how have we financed music? How have artists gotten paid, right? So let's talk about kind of the original communism, right? What Marx called le capitalisme primitif, right? So how was music done then, right? And to your point, I would argue there were even more artists because there was no idea of the professional artist, right? Everyone, again, think back to try to wind back to your caveman brain, right? You're sitting in your cave, you're singing a song, maybe you're painting a painting, right? Like, were you an artist getting paid with a contract and radio? Like, none of these things existed, right? You have a point, yeah.
Well, I think in ancient societies, they still divided folks by roles. Is that not true? And some are the priests, and some are the workers, and some are the music makers. I feel like I've learned about this on various museum trips.
So yeah, this is that's the second point, right? So here we're talking, and again, this is for those who know, this is sort of modes of production, right? In sort of elementary kind of Marxism, right? So Marx talks about the original kind of communism, which is the communism of hunter-gatherers, right? So this is before we specialize. This is before we even settled down, right? This is at the point at which we're traveling in small bands. Again, those people, they sang, they danced, they made paintings, they made sculpture, right? These were artists. But no one was a specialized artist, right? No one just made sculptures. No one just made paintings. They also had to collect their own food. They had to hunt for it. Maybe they were engaged in early agriculture, right? So, I feel like let's first get into the framework of a world where everyone makes art, and art exists as part of a gift economy, right? So, at that point in time, you probably weren't selling your painting, right? You were either giving it away, or at best, you were exchanging it for something else. So, I just went to the museum, and there was a famous picture of the poet Homer, which was actually after this time, but it illustrates the same principle. Homer is sitting there, and 3 shepherd boys are listening to his poem, right? And presumably after that, they either gave him some food or some kind of token to show their appreciation, right? So you're talking about a world where everyone is an artist, and there is not yet social division, there is not yet a social surplus, there is not yet a class system, right? And then we do move towards a very different form of funding the arts, which we all know as patronage, right? Le mécénat. So, if you look at all the great European, sort of medieval painters, right? Like the Sistine Chapel, I looked up this morning, was commissioned by Pope Sixth the something and Pope Julius the something else, right? And they paid for it, right? So how did, Michelangelo pay his rent? How did he get his food? The Pope wrote him a check, or presumably gave him some ducats, right? But gave him some kind of money, right? And this is, again, closer to our modern world. In this era, now we're talking about class stratified society. So here you do have, in Africa you had a caste of griots. You might have, a class of specific artists or craftsmen whose job it is. Now these folks are specialized. Now all they do is sculpt. All they might do is paint. All they might do is sing, right? Beethoven wasn't farming, right? He wasn't going out there and working a day job. He was paid, but again, by nobility, right? By feudal aristocrats. Of course, one of the big drawbacks of the system is you have to do things that these patrons like, right? And we still face this issue today, right? If you're working with a patron, and we'll talk about this in a second, you know, a modern foundation or government agency, you have to do what they like, right? So everything that the European tradition calls fine arts are things that were patronized by these wealthy people. The arts of the people, right, any kind of popular artwork was still existed in the kind of gift economy, right? Those folks did not have patrons, right? If you were, you know, writing lewd lyrics on a brothel's walls in like Florence in 1350, no one was paying you for that work, right? So, you know, the problem with the patronage system is you have to do something your patron likes, right? If your patron doesn't like it, it's either not considered art or you're gonna have to figure out some other way to feed yourself, right? So, but this is the sort of second big way historically that artists have gotten paid, right? So the first one is everyone has a day job, everyone's an artist in their spare time, we all just share. The second one is you find yourself a pope, you find yourself a king or a bishop or someone who likes your stuff, and they will fund it. The third is I bring up because we'll talk about public funding, right? So the other major way that artists have been funded is the state, right? Especially experiments in state socialism in the Soviet Union. If any of you have been to Cuba, for example, right? Like the government there pays artists the same way that the Soviet government also employed writers and painters and sculptors and singers directly, right? So these folks were employed by the state to make their art. Obvious advantage, artists get paid. Obvious disadvantage, artists get censored, right? Everyone knows this, right? So that's the sort of contradiction they had to deal with. And then finally, the fourth major one is the world that we know, which is, again, music is a commodity. There's a market for it. You put your stuff out there. You hope to sell it. Other people buy it. The advantages are technically the market decides, right? It's consumer driven. It's not like the patronage system where it's up to the patron's whims. It's not like the state socialist system where it depends on what bureaucrats like. In this case, the market, everyone is equal. Except we know that everyone is not equal. Some people have way more money than others, right? So if you are a wealthy consumer in Canada, someone is going to try to meet your musical tastes, however terrible they are. Someone will. If you are a poor Sierra Leonean, no one gives two shits about your musical taste. You are non-existent for the market, right? You don't have any purchasing power. So, obvious advantage of markets, it's great, it's consumer driven, no one is imposing anything on you. The disadvantage is no money, no vote, right? No, if you don't have any money, no one cares what you think, right? So that's the world that we live in, which is obviously creates several distortions, right? Because the music that sells, the music that people want to make is the music that sells, not the music that they want to make, not the music that fulfills them, not the music that would, sort of embolden their spirit or someone else's spirit. It's simply what's going to pay the rent. So, we have these four principles. They still exist. We can still find ways in our contemporary kind of North American context of seeing a lot of the same stuff, right? So we still have the market, right? We have record labels, there's publishers, there's venues. All of these folks need to make sure their revenues are higher than their costs, right? We still have patronage, right? We still have foundations and government agencies and corporations that will patronize certain artists, especially if you work in, if you're in the opera or something like that is largely philanthropy. We have public funding, right? In New York, we have the New York State Council for the Arts. I'm sure there's a bunch of groups here in Canada, especially in Quebec. And then artists still practice gifts and mutual aid, right? Artists among themselves will still trade and barter and exchange their own artwork outside of market or capitalist principles. Maybe you wanted to, but you should talk about this.
You can start.
So, where we're trying to land, we call it a vision. We're asking you to come dream with us and let us know if you like this dream. But the vision is, we're trying to figure out what exactly would it take to build a new economy for the arts, right? Concretely, what are the institutions we would need to decommodify art and decommodify music? So we've thought of sort of these 3 or 4. Please feel free to add to the list. Let us know if we're completely wrong. This is the whole point of this is to get your feedback. So, first of all, artist co-ops, right? So cooperatives among artists, right? These already exist in many places. Artist collective, again, none of these ideas are new. They've existed forever. So it's just a matter of remixing them for the 21st century. Artist housing, right? So there are programs that seek to create artists housing specifically for artists, right? So studio space, noise ordinances, a place where artists can actually live and that is dedicated specifically to them and will be permanently affordable. So we'll talk about community land trust more in a second. The third is participatory budgeting for the arts, right? So again, if art is a public good, then it needs to be publicly financed. The problem with public financing is you don't want to put those financing decisions in the hands of bureaucrats. So trying to figure out ways to decentralize and create a more participatory system where everyone, all the citizens of, say, Montreal or Quebec can have a say in where arts funding regionally and locally goes. And then finally, I do popular education. I work for the Center for Popular Economics. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier. So, also trying to figure out a way to do popular education with artists. So what you're seeing here is the first draft of our attempt to do this with groups of artists throughout North America and try to start these conversations on new economy in the arts.
And this started because Francisco came with me to an artist conference. I was speaking at the conference, and he was just thinking about basic, what was it, surplus value? You were asking something about surplus or the economy, and eyes were glazing over, people started sweating, there's, to Francisco, he was so surprised that artists didn't have these basic concepts. So I added that. I think that's a really important element to this vision, is that we start to do more events like this with each other.
So and then we're just going to, for the rest of this time, just share a few examples with you of organizations that are doing the kind of thing that we think could lead us to this vision, right? So they're not, none of these organizations are perfect. Many of them are experiments. Many of them, are likely to fail. But, you have to be realistic, right? So, but these are, we think, the kind of institutions that will get us to this larger vision of sort of a new economy for the arts.
So I'm on the board of Resonate. It's an artist streaming platform. It's like Tidal or Spotify, except that the listeners and the artists are members and member owners of the platform itself. Do you want to explain the numbers behind it? So
yeah, it's artist and listener owned, and the big difference between them and something like Spotify or Pandora is they have this streaming to own concept. So we all know the streaming rate is pitifully low, right? You can get 1 million streams and get a $5 check at the end of it. So what these guys do is, if you stream a song 9 times, you own it. So after the 9th stream, you get the download rate, which is typically much, much higher, right? So if you're getting 0.0001 cent per stream, the download rate is something like 60 cents, right? So I like the song, I listen to it 9 times. The artist gets 60 cents, right? They feel better, I feel better. They can afford to do this by cutting out the middleman, right? This is artist and user owned, so if you notice, there's no record label. There is no one else sitting between the artists and the listeners.
Although they're in the process right now, they're building with a lot of different labels around the world to get their catalog onto the platform. So it just relaunched about 3 weeks ago. It's still definitely David and Goliath. Spotify can afford these huge amounts of money to pay engineers, and Resonate is relying on volunteer engineers, people that are really passionate about the inequities going on. So it's definitely a David and Goliath, but it would be amazing if everyone can check it out, and if anyone has questions about it.
I have a question, is this automatic, the user, after the 9 times they listen to the song, is going to be, take the money out, or is there a proposition to the person between, hey, you like this song, so pay it for it now?
No, so you pay a membership fee. You pay a subscription fee, which goes all of that money goes to the artist minus a small amount for administrative purposes. So it's automatic, right? The moment you play the song 9 times, of the money that goes into all the sort of subscription fees, the artist gets 60 cents.
So check it out. It just relaunched. It needs many more artists on there. So check it out. And something interesting is that when the founder, Perez, we got him a piece in The Guardian to talk about Resonate, just as Spotify was starting to expand and had bought their property in New York City. And Peter said something interesting. He's like, if Tidal had come out, I don't know if folks remember Tidal or no, it's like Jay-Z's. It's still working, yeah. If Tidal had come out, because I don't know if folks remember, it was a huge spectacle of all the superstar artists, Nicki Minaj, all the major artists like 2 years ago, Kanye, they all stood there like, we own this platform. They were using this language of ownership, and Peter, the founder of Resonate, was like, well, if they had just put a regular person in between each of the superstars, then there wouldn't have been a need for Resonate. But really, the Tidal is just kind of a rich artist worker co-op at the end of the day. And so Resonate is really this attempt to be more egalitarian and be, because we don't have many like alternatives to offer artists right now. We're like, oh, we hate Spotify, we hate Tidal, but we don't have things to offer. So Resonate, I think, is a really powerful example where we can send artists to have an alternative. Yes?
They have an app
Yes.
for Android as well.
I believe so. Yeah. Yeah, I can follow up with you. And a part of are folks familiar with Imogen Heap? She's also like really a huge advocate of artist sovereignty and autonomy, and has a foundation called Mycelia Foundation, and has been doing a lot of advocacy around educating artists around the economy, and is working closely with Resonate. She has a whole project called Music Passport, that is a way to be able to pay for different works on different platforms. So it's worth checking out her work as well. And super outspoken about it. Imogen Heap, Mycelia Music. Mycelia is like, I don't know if folks know what Mycelia is. It's like the mushroom networks. It's this whole idea of like connecting networks. And Peter gives a great podcast, so I'm happy to send around some resources with him. I'm a member of this collective in Sacramento called Soul Collective. It's a center dedicated to arts, culture, and activism. And so, let's see, how do I...
We'll explain Soul Life afterwards.
Okay, cool. So it's a venue. It's essentially a music venue. It's now community owned. So the community is owned by the people that run it, which is extremely powerful. And so you can see there's a retail space, they have a recording studio, they have a podcast studio, they have an art gallery. I came into contact with this space because they were booking bands that I worked with. So they were actually able to take chances to book Bomba Stereo before Live Nation and Windish started taking a chance on Latin alternative artists. So this is, they were taking a chance on these artists before kind of the industry started to. So that's how I came into contact with them. And discussing experience within the music business, we came together and we're like, maybe we didn't know much about the solidarity economy or the cooperative economy in the US, but we were inspired by the Zapatista movement, what was going on in South America. I was like, maybe we should start a co-op label. Not really understanding how cooperative works or what it is. So we've been on this like long project together of like, how can we actually release artists together and cooperatize the publicity, for example, or go in on the marketing materials, and also put together festivals. So we have a festival called Global Local, which I don't have it up right now, but to give you an example, Stella, the head of Soul Collective, was able to give my community in New York City a seed grant to start a festival in New York City called Global Local, which actually I think there's a slide. So we're starting, this is how I believe we will transform the music business, is having these kind of relationships and networks that are outside of the monopolized booking agencies. So this is we do a showcase at South by Southwest where we primarily showcase Latinx, Black, Indigenous artists, which South by Southwest for a long time was not selecting those artists to be official artists. This is like 8-9 years ago. So we created a space, we were able to get an official showcase standing and give artists the opportunity to perform. And then that has expanded to these small little festivals in Sacramento, in Austin, in New York. And the vision is like, could we do global locals around the country? Could we do a global local in Montreal? And so that's part of the larger vision. They have a podcast network. They showcase artists every month. It's super vibrant. And what's really powerful is that they now own their space. So through my work at New Economy Coalition, I'm trying to really make the case that we need to start networking spaces like this, that is really powerful. If we could be in contact with all these different spaces around the country, and they exist. I'm not going to go over all of them, but there are centers like this around the country. Oh, so this is the Global Local Festival in New York. So again, Stella from Soul Collective gave us the seed money. Staten Island is an outer borough. It's considered, it's a pretty peripheral, marginalized place. Like I mentioned earlier, I worked in the New York City Arts Festival, and I experienced firsthand how Summer Stage, which is publicly funded, wasn't even coming to the periphery, to Staten Island, and producing quality arts there. So we took matters into our own hands. We were like, we need to do our own festival. And like I said, Stella gave us a small grant. And 5 years later, Summer Stage came back around to us because of the work that we had done. And they were like, you guys are doing this really well. Like, can we support what you're doing? So now we're celebrating 5 years in July, and you're all invited. And the vision is, could we do these global locals outside of the Live Nation paradigm around the country? And I think that we should try. And we're women-led. It's 2 women throwing the festival. We really try to prioritize women, POC. This is a transgender undocumented folkloric dance group from Staten Island. So this, when we say local, global, it's not a branding thing. Like, we mean it. Like, we're trying to bring global artists to a local environment and also promote local artists that represent the globe. Like I said with Soul Collective, there are these spaces around the country. So one of them is Rhythm Conspiracy. They're an artist and worker-owned cooperative enterprise. Yeah, they're in New Orleans. They come out of the blues tradition, and they work with artists. If you need a publicist, if you need a booking agent, a marketer, a merchandiser, they're kind of like a one-stop shop for artists. And I came across them on the internet, and they're still going, and we're still in process of linking these connections with one another. But you can look them up and connect with them. Just Seeds is an artist cooperative. They more focus on digital graphics and propaganda and social movement arts. They're a crew of 29 folks. I just want to make folks aware that they exist, because a lot of times folks are like, oh, artist-owned enterprises, that can't work. And really, this work is to try to visualize that these things are happening. Because even within the world that I work in, with worker-owned co-ops that have nothing to do with artists, they don't know that there are actually artist-run enterprises. And so our goal is to try to connect these dots more. Because we need a crew of 29 artists making art to get people to imagine that capitalism isn't the only thing.
And it's to build solidarity in industries where the people are often freelancing.
Right. And
you create a very toxic environment when everyone's competing and trying to survive, right? So this is an example of, these are 29 graphic designers, normally pretty cutthroat business, who got together and decided to work collectively.
This was someone who was on the Resonate board with me. This was a tweet storm after Red Bull decided to close. Did you guys hear about this? Red Bull Radio is completely gone. And he kind of verbalized what Soul Collective and the vision of Global Local is in some ways, but he put language to it, which is something I think we need to do more work around this. But he's kind of responding in a snarky way, oh, Red Bull, when was Red Bull actually going to really be about building legit music communities? In a win, they could just shut down, which is what ended up happening. And so he kind of goes on this rant around, what if we actually were creative and thought about community, scene, what did he say? Scene wealth funds, right? That would help with travel and visas and recording time. It wouldn't just have to be these agencies competing with one another, providing these services for artists, but there would be kind of local scene funds that would raise the money to support artists to do this type of work. So this is just an example, like, people are out there proposing ideas. Matt is someone you should all follow. Really, he's constantly thinking about this stuff.
Right. So I mean, this is just, we show you this to let you know that, you know, we're not the only people thinking about this stuff. The people in this room, there are other folks, very smart, also trying to figure out how to do this. Right. And again, it shows you the Red Bull system was a patronage system, and it shows you the limits to that, which is the moment the patron decides they want to do something else, they just take their ball and go home, right? And the game is over. So, you know, in this case,
I knew the guy. It was basically based all around hype. So they would just go and look at, oh, this person has 100,000. It wasn't based the whole model of that. I know the guy Thor. I know that I had interactions. I know specific detail to how that they operated, and it had basically nothing to do with helping. Very little. I mean, they had a little bit of education element, but essentially it was a giant advertising thing for them.
Exactly.
That's what you're saying, right?
yeah. I mean, this is the problem with that kind of model, right? Which is, what are they in it for? They're not in it for the music, right? They're in it it's a marketing thing, right? So they care about how many, you know, how much clout do you have?
I
and how
remember
can you
during that
monetize
age
it?
when I was working with Black and Latinx artists, I would see Red Bull in the scene, and I would complain. I'm like, Red Bull really has wings, and I put like $sign for the S.
There are some big companies out there. They're very few, but there are a small amount that are willing to work with artists in the long term. But they are.
Right, but I mean, our point is, you know, you find good patrons, right? There are nice patrons, but it's still the power imbalance is always going to be there in the sense that
it's in the capitalist kind of framework with you.
Right, like one side has all the money and the other, you know, and like they can be nice about it and be like, we'll fund you for a long time and we're willing to invest in you, but like, you know, it's up to them always, right?
This idea around like popular education, I mean, one of the points I was going to bring up is, I don't know if folks are familiar with the divest movement. A lot of people are trying to get their colleges to divest from the fossil fuel companies. So I've had a lot of ideas around what if we could do something like that around these large corporate entities in the culture industry. He wasn't really feeling it, but I do think that there's a role. There's an Instagram account called Art Exit. They used to be called Get Artists Paid. I'm an advisor on it, but it's two young people, they're about 20, 21 years old, started this Instagram and just did a lot of research of like who are actually the people sitting on these museum boards, who are the people sitting on these corporation boards, and they would create manifestos, they would work with artists to create graphics like you see below. And so I think there's like a really important role for agitation like that, of like doing research and putting it out there, making it appealing to artists so that artists are aware of what's actually going on. So you can check out their Instagram. Do you have your hand raised?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you go back 10, 15 years maybe, the Jazz Fest, other festivals in Montreal, they used to have like the Du Maurier stage and the players scene and all that stuff. I mean, so Big Tobacco was funding, I mean, not just music, but also, sports and whatnot. And then when that was legislated out, it was a huge gap, and they were even worried, like, are we going to have a Just for Laughs festival? Are we going to have this or whatever? And no worries, because gambling and alcohol came in, and we're good, But it's what happens if you took those out? Then who's the big patron, I guess?
Mining companies.
Well, when we're talking in New Orleans, we're working with some organizers in New Orleans because they wanted to do a global local New Orleans during Jazz Fest, which is funded by Shell. So what would take the place of it, which is not, this is a hard argument, but it's like grassroots small stuff. Like La Isla Bonita Festival was like literally a stage in the grass when we started. And like, this is a big issue. Do we want Coachellas in all of our towns, or do we want to like meet our neighbors and like promote the local artists in our community? This is like a big question that we need to ask ourselves. Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying, and it's so weird to have the camera.
No, me too. That's why I wouldn't do it.
Hi, everybody at home.
It's not live streamed.
Oh, okay. No, I just feel like part of the capitalist capitalism impulse that's been like so ingrained in all of us. It's like more, bigger, and like, yeah, I feel like even with, like, that's the kind of thinking to start to deconstruct and just think about like, what is like the value of these things, and also like I feel like a lot of, or I know people who are like expecting to make the money that you make like working for the man or whatever, and like it's just not gonna be that, but looking at other like anti-capitalist or like anarchist or just like friendship-based like modes of support and of like the solidarity economy that you were talking about. But yeah, I mean, if you're trying to have the biggest, most massive thing because that's the only way something's like successful or valuable, like we are all just gonna end up Coachella, which is not the point, right?
And I have a very personal experience with that. Like, I pitched the Afro-Latino artists that I was working with. I cold pitched them for Coachella and got them on. And they were the first Afro-Latino band to play Coachella. And still, a year later, you know, they were struggling to pay their child support or pay their rent. You know, so it's not even... So I saw their bubble burst, too. Like, they played on this major stage. They had all this major press. But, like, what are we selling them? Ultimately, it isn't sustainable.
So, Rebecca, did you want to say something?
More on the topic of sort of subversive, like hijacking festivals and stuff, like a lot of festivals. Like, for example, I can think of from Cape Town, of a collective I participated in, like, that was doing action against the month of photography, which is a photography festival, in which there was an application that had a fee. And so a lot of folks who were color or coming from marginal communities could not apply. And subsequently, the festival was like mostly white photographers. So these like promoted an action of an alternative festival called Month of People's Photography. It had almost the same logo. Mm-hmm. And they sort of piggybacked on top of the publicity of the major festival and confused people.
Yes, I love that.
Into seeing different exhibitions of folks who, you know, normally would take. Mm-hmm. So I like the idea of sort of, you know, using the momentum of like a corporate run festival and sort of diverting attention.
Art Exit did that. They hijacked something at the New Museum in New York and created all these flyers that looked like the materials of the New Museum and got a lot of attention. So I think, and this is their manifesto. Like, a lot of young artists don't have this language. You know, I think this effort started because a lot of the folks who started this Friends were getting hit up by paper magazine or large fashion outlets and being asked to submit their work for free, even though it was from multi-billion-dollar companies. And so they were providing these, like, let's just make these manifestos and try to give artists more language for how to fight back.
Yeah, to me it's a fascinating evolution of sort of politically engaged artists, where they went originally from being a kind of just a discussion forum for prices, essentially, right? These are all freelancers being like, how much should I be charging, right? This magazine wants me to write for free or take pictures for free, to then being like, who is running these organizations, and starting to do power mapping and looking at who's donating to these big, you know, who's on the boards of these major museums. Actually, we've seen this in the States with like the opioid crisis, and really taking a look at where does this money come from? Yeah.
So the other thing with the festivals is they're predicated on being able to draw a sufficient crowd to be able to fill their bank, right? And that means they have to get the headliners, but the headliners get the big money out of the artists that get paid big money. Right. But then you go down to the lower levels of the smaller stages and stuff, and they're actually better off playing in, you know, a dive bar than on stage. But then they get blocked out for 2 or 3 months by the contract, right? So they can't even play in that dive bar where they might play every week if they play the Oceaga or whatever. I don't know if you guys know. So, and then that's publicly funded on top of it.
I know.
Right? And that money goes into the organizers' pockets, not into the artists' pockets. Anyway, anything you don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this is why we talk about the superstar system, right? I think this is why, like, we really, like, need to have this conversation more, because you're right? Like,
and we built a plaza for them with public fucking money
Yeah,
for $40 million.
The superstar, it's it's out of the cult of personality. It's out of this putting up this person on the pedestal. It's gone past the music. It's not the music anymore. It's this person on a pedestal. It's the king, and the aspirations of the individual projecting onto this thing. And it's actually really a very deep-seated psychological capitalist. It's
Right, but people think they can be. I'm going to be the headliner one day.
Exactly.
Right, and that's how they get it. Where it's
aspire to be on that
where it's
stage.
like, realistically, 1% is 1%. That means 99% of you are out, right? And I would never play those odds, right? If you had a 99% chance of losing, but most people think, hey, I'm gonna, because winner takes all, right? So I'm gonna win, and then it'll be me taking the entire pot of funds. And then the other issues you brought up, is public funding, which is, it drives me nuts because part of the, one of the things we want to also kind of emphasize is we need to democratize this public funding, right? Who gets to decide where this public funding goes, right? This is money that technically belongs to the people of Quebec or the people of Montreal or the people of New York or Massachusetts, right? These are our tax dollars, and instead there's a different set of gatekeepers, but gatekeepers nonetheless, who are the ones who decide where that money goes. Which
So
artists
can you
are
talk about what is democratizing grant money?
So
actually
what
look
that
like?
means, so there's
like
a-
real example that's happening, like Ujima.
So there's nothing like this in arts funding. There are people trying to do things like this. The next example we have is participatory budgeting, which I know has been happening in Toronto. It's been happening in a few places in the States. One of the things that comes through very clearly in all of these processes is people want arts funding. They fund a lot of museums, they fund a lot of murals, they fund a lot of public artwork, right? Which again, to the idea that art is a public good, right? The public wants more art, right? And when they're given the choice to make that decision, that is what they decide, right? But again, we don't want to replicate what exists in the Soviet Union or in Cuba, where a small handful of bureaucrats decides which artists get paid. So one of the ideas is that has not been tried, but people have been banning about, is what's called an artistic freedom voucher. So in essence, right, you would take the budget of any of these public agencies. So, it would be better to simply have a universal basic income for artists. But if not that, then something like this could work, where you would take all the public money available in Quebec, say, and just divide it by the number of citizens, right? So everyone here would get, say, $100 to donate to their favorite artist or arts organization, right? So that way, it's like a market in the sense that you choose, right? So we preserve consumer choice, but it's unlike a market in the sense that it's equal. Everyone gets the same size voucher.
But it's still a market because some artists will have more means to ask for more money.
Doesn't it still go to nickel?
The information about who I have to give the money will not
Right,
be
so-
clear. Like some artists are more wealthy than others.
Oh, of course. So part of this proposal is you would cap the amount of money that anyone could get. So you would say you can get up to, let's say, $100,000 a year, and then no more, right? So all the money goes in. Everyone gets, say, $100 to spend. You could divide it up however you want. Some artists will, Jay-Z and Beyonce are going to get a lot of, will get a lot of money in this scenario, but it would be capped, right? So again, if these are public institutions up for democratic debate, then all of these things are possible, right? We can simply just decide we want to limit. Yeah?
I mean, sorry for my English, but I'll try to explain the first thing about that, okay, maybe state or city or fundings or public fundings has to protect the music which is not listened. I mean, for example, here in Montreal, but it works in France many so much, they said, okay, popular music is listened on streaming platform, on radio, so all the money is going to opera, classic music, to have some professional musicians. And so it means that if you ask the people, okay, we give all the money to Jay-Z, okay, what about the other art? What about the other way to express yourself? And this is the same thing with opera. And second point, and I will be a little bit critic, but that's my favorite role. That are you not reinventing the
wheel?
The wheel, because I did my PhD about anti-fascist do-it-yourself community in Europe, and what you are presenting, it exists since 30, 40 years. It works. but it works in a non-profit view in a special cases of publics, but it works.
It's more
So
communities too. Like it's
yeah.
spread
So
to-
I mean, it's of course this is a way. Of course this is our point, but why trying to do it in another way if it still exists and did work? Like, I mean, Epitaph, like a record label, was awesome because it was not only about music publishing, it was producing new artists. It was a repetition, equal repetition about if an artist works and the other not. There is some action and stuff like that. So, I mean, what?
So, I mean, to your first point, this is one of the big issues. Is who would be the biggest? I feel like issue with this proposal is who would be eligible to get the money, right? Because anytime you bring politics into art, someone's going to say, "Well, I find this obscene. These people already have too much money." But I think the point is simply to democratize it, right? It's let's have the debate. Let's decide as a community what are our norms. What are our values? Do we value the music that isn't being, that isn't doing well in the market? Do we value traditional Quebecois music, right? Do we want, what? Because right now we're not having that debate. Right now it's what do you value? Well, whatever I spend my money on Spotify or something, and that's it, right? And we're not having a democratic debate. And then the second point, you're absolutely right. None of this is new, and to me it's a larger philosophical point. This is why I start with the original communism. In many ways, all we're trying to do is go back to our caveman days, where everyone could be an artist, right? Like we're trying to actually go back to the future, right? Like it's that kind of contradictory thing. None of this is new. People have done it before. I don't know why we have to reinvent the wheel. I don't know why the boulder comes back down and we have to push it back up. But I'm a simple economist. So you had a point, and then Chloe.
I mean, I feel like we all need a basic income, right?
Yeah.
And that's the way that we can start to go back to everyone being on an equal footing, or like somewhat.
They can work together. The music community can be fighting in a very positive way for and take a leadership role. People that are producers, musicians, all the collective creative music people. Sorry.
Yeah, but I think labeling like certain people like artists, it gets to be part of the problem, right?
This is part of what is like, just to nerd out, like we're talking about using social capital, right? Which is what culture and music to sort of bring forward something like when I talk to some people about economics, they like glaze over, But then I'm like, oh, but this musician doesn't really do this and doing this thing, and then in their lyrics they're talking about certain kinds of ideas. But my original point was like, I think trying to take that model and use it in different ways is really interesting, and that's something I've been trying to work through because I feel like we have a patronage model in Montreal where a lot of artists are like putting themselves like this certain identity that they think is going to be attractive to, let's face it, many racist funders, right? And especially we're talking about artists in the global south, and how do we like work together so that it's not like who's the flavor of the month. Like this year, it's like people from West Africa. Next year, it's going to be this, and so people are putting together these sort of like essentialized identities so that we'll get quality, whereas everyone could just like share. Right? Like, okay, we have this much money, we know this festival's going to happen, and we know all these things are going to happen. How do we like support each other to get those contracts, to get those bookings, and like not be competing against each other for this, like, to like someone else's idea of what this music is. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why, again, the market is terrible because it means that you have to, I encounter this a lot with West African artists where many of them would have one album for the local sort of scene, which was their best album, but made very little money, and then you put out your album that would help you tour in Europe because that's the only way you were going to get paid. Which meant that you had to then meet, and some of them enjoyed it, but some of them were like, look, I don't want to remix my album. Like, it's fine as it is, right? So, but again, who has the money to pay for it? And, I do think this stuff is compatible with the universal basic income in the sense that universal basic income says, listen, you're all free to do whatever you want. In this case, we're also saying, in addition to you being free to do whatever you want, we would like to pay you to make some great art for us.
Right.
But I think people freak out at universal basic income, like
Yeah.
the general population.
Yeah.
So
Well, within the New Economy Coalition, it's a debate. Like, we have leaders that are for it and write op-eds about it that I have to place, and then we have people that are against it. So it's like a robust debate that's happening right now.
So Peter,
I just want to change the direction of the conversation a bit, but hopefully in an interesting way. What about climate change? And how does a lack of access to cheap fossil fuels change the entire music economy, which I think it does in a huge way, because right now it's based on people touring because they can't sell their recordings. It's based on ceaseless touring, which means people are just flying around the globe nonstop, which is totally not sustainable in the long term. So to me it means music scenes have to become more local, maybe in combination with more environmentally friendly ways of getting artists around.
I know that there are some folks working on that. I would have to research, but I've come across folks that are trying to raise that conversation, at least in the U.S., of like how to do like zero waste touring and this type of thing. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I think it's an important discussion.
I mean, we obviously can't touch on everything, but to me, this is an environmental proposal in the sense that it's built on two ideas. One, the sense that, you know, we want people to work less, right? Like, the biggest solution to meet the climate is just, let's just have less stuff. And at least here in North America, I think we would be happier, right? So, again, going back to the original caveman, they weren't working that hard, right? They collected their food for the day, and then they went home and hung out, right?
In those traditional societies, musicians didn't travel as far.
Right.
So you could be a musician and highly respected in your local community that would only ever go 20 miles from your home. But when you died, like everyone in the community would show up to your funeral and you'd be like an honored member of the community. But that involves thinking about music and a music economy in a very different way.
Right, if you think about it as a public, this is for the whole community, right?
There's just another little piece. I think capitalism comes in there pretty big because a friend of mine who studies this stuff was saying that there's often like regional exclusivity agreements where if you tour somewhere and you play a show with one booking agency, they want you to not play anywhere in that region, that whole region, for the next 6 months or whatever. And so as a result, you end up with a situation where people are where you could actually be getting a lot more juice out of the travel that you have done, but you by going to smaller venues or smaller cities and so on, but you don't because you have to sign this agreement.
I mean, that's part of it, right? If you could survive and just make enough money, you would tour if you wanted to, but there wouldn't be that compulsion, right? If you could just be an artist and live here, you know, get a living wage here in Montreal, I don't know how many folks would want that kind of punishing pace.
But who's your audience? Like, unless you're the house band, how many times can you play
Right now,
in one spot and draw a crowd? I mean, I'm actually going to a show later on today where it is that. Bootlegger, they have the site for it's the Urban Science Band, but I mean, I don't think every band can aspire to have a regular gig and earn a living.
Well, they're a great example though, because aren't they a huge collective?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's like what we've been, like, as we start to think more collectively, all sorts of things open up and become possible. But I feel like, yeah, it is hard within capitalism because it does always feel like if you have something, that means I don't. And like breaking that.
But the music economy.
I think she had
Yeah. Oh, we're doing hands, sorry.
It's okay.
No, I just realized I didn't bring them.
Yeah, just as someone who's interested in organizing cultural events and stuff, like this is super interesting to me. And I'm also trying to figure out like how can I live out of it, but also create something that's accessible. Like I don't want to create something that you have to pay like so much money to go to. And so right now I'm like preparing to go to like a business school to learn all of these things that I don't really know. Like I have lots of ideas, but I don't have the tools. And so I'm wondering if you think it makes sense to like learn all of these more like conventional marketing, finance tools which are still like inscribed within capitalism and then like create alternatives. or like could you just like go straight to the, you know, while still like
We're still at this cusp, you know. I'm aware of Bennington College in Vermont. Like they're trying to start an MA program for artists, MFA, but on the solidarity economy. So like this is how new this stuff is, where they're just even now imagining what would that coursework actually look like, you know? So
How much would it cost?
I think it actually is funded, and in exchange you teach. There's a solidarity economy artist named Caroline Willard, who's like the first fellow of it. And in exchange, she's just teaching. She teaches like a load. So I don't know if I can give you your whole life advice right here, but what would you say? I mean, he's also working on a curriculum. So he works with an organization called the Center for Popular Economics that does economics trainings for organizers, social movement organizers. So the idea, now that we're thinking about this more and more, is he's going to be testing this on a group of artists next year in Miami, a group of black women artists in Miami, and do a week long of like this stuff, but like deeper and like a little bit more like in depth. So the stuff is brewing. Like I would keep in touch with us, and then maybe just do your MBA because you still gotta understand those tools. But yeah.
I mean, I think like we were talking about, it's a strategy thing, right? Like it's an insight. Like we have a friend in common who's doing things on a very big scale right now. We were chatting about that before. And like some people want to go, it's a system. And like, I mean, you can tell cultural management. Like that was the first thing. And when you told me, I'm like, the idea that, like when we're talking, like what are we talking about? That it's to be managed by a person in a position of power. Like already it's so super problematic.
Yeah.
But that, yeah, it's a choice. It's a personal choice, right? And I think no one can make that for you. Like you have, this is for sure going to create awkward things if you're trying, if this is where you're at and these are your interests, but maybe that's your strategy. And on that note, Drew and I have talked about doing something similar to what Francisco is doing, about doing popular economics for artists, for musicians here in Montreal.
Yeah, I think my issue is that like I was interested in finding these things, but like the only course I could find was like in a business school.
Yeah.
So that's why, yeah.
I would also say the best education is like just working at a venue or like the Harbor Friends Center here, whatever is like the public cultural venue out here. That has been the best school for me, is like working in these different kind of sectors within music.
It's also that I tried to work like in the cultural sector and I didn't feel like I had enough experience and I wasn't getting any jobs, so that's why it's like a struggle.
And yeah, we all have to figure it out until we get to Utopia.
And we can talk after.
So I mean, we just to wrap
Yeah,
this
we'll
up.
wrap this up.
The last example we wanted to share with you is the Big Car Collaborative. We haven't met them yet, but they're trying to create a community land trust in Indianapolis, in Indiana.
Explain what a community
I'm going to explain in a second. So, in this case, a community land trust, for those who don't know, means the land is owned by an institution, and that institution puts certain, it's owned by a legal trust, and you can put certain stipulations. So this is a way essentially to take land off the market, to say, look, as if we know that people are going to come in here and speculate, so before that happens or as it's happening, let's simply, this institution is going to buy the land, and it is going to own it, and will allow certain people to live there. Different ones have different arrangements, but usually the land itself is owned by the land trust, and then the building, the house or the apartment building, is owned by its residents. And there's limits on who you can sell to, or if you can sell at all. So in this case, they bought 12 abandoned houses. They're renovating them. The houses, you must be an artist. You must have a certain income. If you try to sell it, the only stipulation is the house has to be sold at an affordable rate to another artist whenever you decide to leave. Right? So, and again, the house, you don't own the house. You don't own the land. You own, you're technically a shareholder, and then once you leave, you cash out your shares. So, this is a way of especially like, again, cities that are gentrifying, where artists are coming in and being used to gentrify certain neighborhoods and districts. This is a way to avoid that, to be like, look, we want artists to come in, but instead of having this land just on the market where speculators can come in and buy and sell it whatever price they want. We're going to simply take it off and dedicate it specifically for artists. So this is another way people have been thinking about, again, how do you make sure that people can pay their rent without touring constantly?
And they have to put in some hours doing community service as
So,
part of the
and they have like an
rentals.
artist in residency program, so they're supposed to do some public arts programming, right? There's certain things, you know, it's not simply a tenant and, you know, kind of landlord or kind of land, you know, it's not as simple as buying a house.
This is in NYC?
This is in Indianapolis.
Indianapolis, okay.
And there's some in Minneapolis, I think. Oakland is talking about doing this, so the Oakland Community Land Trust just bought a place where artists were currently living, and they're trying to turn it now into an artist-owned community land trust that would be dedicated to artists for as long as the trust survives. So you had a question?
Just bouncing back on it, actually, on what you're saying about community land trusts. Actually, there's a cooperative land trust here in Montreal. I think it's the biggest one in North America, if I'm not mistaken. But Milton Park, which waged a fight against big business. You know, they're trying to build hotels and stuff on these 8 square blocks right in downtown, and they waged a fight for over 20 years to get to keep that land as cooperative housing. And now it's the biggest cooperative land trust. It's not specifically for artists. Although there are a lot of artists living there, but I'd like to know more about, because you mentioned Soul Collective also off the top, about how to bridge those two, because there's a strong cooperative movement in Montreal. There's collectives of artists and stuff who are doing their thing, but to actually own a venue, it's been like one of the really, really big struggles in Montreal. Like a lot of venues are shutting down, there's noise complaints, or like gentrification, raising rents or stuff like that. It's very hard to imagine how I would, or how us, a group of people, collective, would go about like buying a building or buying a venue. So I don't know if you have any insights into how this was done, or.
Yeah, I'm trying to get Estella for Soul Collective to like make a binder of like how she did it for 10 years. And she's just getting to that point where she's actually about to leave the venue in collective ownership, and she's gonna leave to, I hope, advise. So maybe we can bring her here and talk. But that was like 10 years of work and like deep community development. So they did a multi-pronged thing where it was like part crowdfunding, where people just loved the center so much, it had provided so much value throughout the years that they had a very strong crowdfunding campaign. And it was like also like personal relationships with